The morning of March 7th, 1945, dawned grey and cold across the Rhine Valley. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engerman had been at war for 3 years, fighting his way from North Africa through Sicily, across France, and now into the heart of Germany itself. He had seen cities reduced to rubble, witnessed the death of friends, and learned to read terrain with the instinct of a predator. But nothing in those years of combat had prepared him for what he saw when his reconnaissance unit crested the wooded heights overlooking the small resort town of Remagen. His hands shook as he raised the binoculars to his eyes. Not from fear, though fear was certainly present in that moment. Not from cold, though the March wind cut through his uniform. His hands trembled from the sheer impossibility of what lay before him. The bridge was standing, against all logic, against all intelligence reports, against every assumption that had guided Allied planning for 6 months. The Ludendorff Bridge stood intact across the Rhine River. Engerman had to look twice to convince himself he was not hallucinating. The bridge's twin stone towers rose like medieval fortifications on both banks. The steel arch structure spanning the water looked solid, functional, impossibly whole. German military vehicles were still crossing it. He could see them clearly through the afternoon haze, tiny shapes moving across the span like ants on a steel thread. Behind him, other officers were gathering, drawn by something in his posture, in the way he had frozen with the binoculars pressed to his face. Lieutenant Colonel Karl Timmermann came up beside Engerman and followed his gaze. Timmermann was 22 years old, born in Frankfurt, Germany, brought to America as an infant when his parents emigrated. He spoke German like a native and understood German military doctrine better than most American officers. When he saw the bridge, he understood immediately what it meant. Every intelligence briefing for the past 6 months had emphasized one absolute certainty. The Germans would destroy every bridge across the Rhine before Allied forces could capture them. Orders had come directly from the highest levels of German command. No bridge was to fall intact into enemy hands. The penalty for failure was execution. Yet there it stood. 300 meters of steel and stone spanning Germany's last great natural barrier against invasion from the west. Timmerman spoke the thought that would echo through military history. We have to take it, right now, before they blow the damned thing to hell. What none of them could know in that crystalline moment of recognition was that the capture of this single bridge would trigger a catastrophic collapse of German defensive strategy. The psychological impact would be so devastating that German officers would later describe it as the moment they knew with absolute certainty that the war was lost. The mathematics of warfare were about to shift fundamentally, written not in the blood of soldiers but in the cold calculus of strategic geometry and operational possibilities. The Rhine was far more than just another river to cross. It was 300 meters of swift-moving water, deep enough to drown tanks, wide enough to make artillery support of an assault force nearly impossible. The currents ran at speeds that could overturn assault boats. The banks rose steeply on both sides, creating natural kill zones where attacking infantry would be exposed to withering fire. Since the days when Roman legions under Julius Caesar first gazed across these waters into the forests of Germania, the Rhine had served as Western Germany's primary defense against invasion. In March 1945, that ancient strategic reality remained unchanged. The river represented the last hope of the Nazi high command to buy time. Time to sue for a separate peace with the Western Allies. Time to transfer battered divisions from the collapsing Eastern Front for a final stand. Time to deploy the secret weapons that propaganda claimed would turn the tide of war. The presence of a single intact bridge would demolish those desperate calculations in the time it took for one infantry company to sprint across 300 meters of steel and stone. The context of catastrophe had been building for months. The offensive in the Ardennes, launched in December with such fanfare and such desperate hope, had ended in complete disaster by late January. What German propaganda had trumpeted as a decisive counter-offensive that would split the Allied armies and drive them back to the sea had instead consumed the last mobile reserves of the Wehrmacht. 100,000 German casualties, 600 tanks destroyed, entire panzer divisions reduced to hollow shells commanded by colonels who had once led armies. The offensive had achieved nothing except to hasten Germany's defeat. By early March, 12 Allied divisions were pressing toward the Rhine along a front that stretched from the lowlands of the Netherlands all the way south to the Swiss border. The German 15th Army, responsible for defending the crucial sector between Cologne and Koblenz, could barely muster 50,000 combat-effective troops. They faced a force 5 times that size, supported by overwhelming artillery and complete air superiority. The German soldiers knew they were not fighting to win. They were fighting to delay, to buy hours or days before the inevitable retreat across the Rhine. The Ludendorff Bridge itself carried layers of irony that would have been visible to anyone who understood its history. Named after General Erich Ludendorff, one of Germany's most brilliant strategists during the First World War, the bridge had been built between 1916 and 1919, primarily by Russian prisoners of war. Those prisoners, working under brutal conditions that killed many of them, had constructed their bridge with Germanic thoroughness. The steel trusses were designed to carry fully loaded military trains. The stone towers at each end contained 3 stories of defensive positions. 4 massive stone piers had been sunk deep into the Rhine's bedrock to support the weight. The original specifications had called for demolition chambers to be built directly into the structure. Cavities designed to hold explosives so the bridge could be destroyed quickly if it faced capture. After the First World War, when French occupation forces controlled the Rhineland, those chambers had been filled with concrete. The French had no intention of making it easy for Germany to destroy infrastructure that might someday serve French military purposes. When the Führer retook the Rhineland in 1936, thumbing his nose at the Treaty of Versailles, German engineers had attached 60 zinc-lined boxes to the bridge's girders. Each box was designed to hold 3 kilograms of explosives. The system was engineered for simultaneous detonation that would drop the entire structure into the Rhine in seconds. But Nazi paranoia had intervened in October of 1944. An American bomb had struck the Mulheim Bridge in Cologne, detonating its prepositioned demolition charges and destroying the bridge before German forces had intended to blow it. The Führer's rage had been volcanic and murderous. He ordered immediate court-martial of the officers responsible and demanded that all demolition charges on Rhine bridges be removed immediately and stored in nearby facilities. New orders specified that charges could only be replaced when Allied forces came within 8 kilometers. Bridges could only be destroyed by written order from sector commanders. The policy created an impossible situation for German officers. Destroy a bridge too early and face court-martial for eliminating a vital retreat route while German forces still needed it. Wait too long and face execution for allowing strategic infrastructure to fall into enemy hands. The psychological pressure paralyzed decision-making at precisely the moment when quick, decisive action was most critical. German officers facing these contradictory imperatives found themselves frozen, unable to act without written orders that often never arrived because the officers authorized to give them were dead, captured, or cut off by the rapidly advancing Americans. The American advance toward Remagen had been designated Operation Lumberjack, a deliberately modest name for what would become one of the most consequential movements of the entire war. The operation's primary objectives were the capture of Cologne and Koblenz, 2 ancient cities that controlled vital Rhine crossings. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' First Army drove eastward through the rugged Eifel region, facing German resistance that had degraded from organized defense to desperate, improvised delaying actions, fought by ad hoc battle groups thrown together from whatever units could be scraped together. German commanders harbored no illusions about stopping the American advance. Their orders were simple: delay. Buy time for more troops to retreat across the Rhine before the bridges were blown. Every hour of delay meant hundreds more German soldiers might escape encirclement. Major General John Leonard's 9th Armoured Division led the American spearhead. The division had been nicknamed the Phantom Division because German intelligence had repeatedly reported it destroyed, only to encounter it again days later in a completely different sector. The nickname had become a point of pride among the division's soldiers. The morning of March 7th began with fog blanketing the entire Rhine Valley, reducing visibility to a few dozen meters. At German headquarters throughout the region, command chaos had reached levels that would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht of 1940. General Edwin von Rothkirch, commander of the 53rd Corps responsible for the Remagen sector, had accidentally wandered into American lines on March 6th while trying to reach his headquarters. He had been captured without firing a shot, still carrying classified documents in his staff car. His replacement, General Richard von Bothmer, could not physically reach Remagen because American units had already cut the roads. At 1 in the morning on March 7th, General Otto Hitzfeld of the 67th Corps received notification that he now bore responsibility for defending the Ludendorff Bridge, despite being 64 kilometers away and having never actually seen the structure. Hitzfeld immediately dispatched his adjutant, Major Hans Scheller, to take command of the bridge defence. Scheller departed at 3 in the morning with 8 men, a radio unit, and orders to commandeer retreating units to form a defensive perimeter. The journey became a nightmare odyssey of wrong turns, American roadblocks, mechanical breakdowns, and fuel shortages. The radio unit became separated at a crossroads when the driver took a wrong turn in the darkness. Scheller did not arrive at Remagen until 11:15 in the morning, less than 2 hours before American forces would emerge from the forests overlooking the town. Captain Willy Bratke, the German officer actually present at Remagen and nominally in command, commanded a force that existed primarily on paper. Official strength reports listed 600 men. The actual combat power consisted of 36 soldiers, most of them either recovering from wounds, elderly men from the Volkssturm militia, or young boys who looked terrified in uniforms too large for their thin frames. Many were Osttruppen, Soviet prisoners of war who had agreed to wear German uniforms to escape the horror of POW camps. Their willingness to fight Americans was questionable at best. Their training was minimal. Their equipment was a hodgepodge of obsolete rifles and a handful of machine guns with limited ammunition. Bratke had spent weeks pleading desperately for reinforcements, for proper communications equipment, for anything that might help him defend what everyone acknowledged was a strategic objective of immense importance. His requests had disappeared into the chaos of a collapsing command structure. Staff officers promised support that never materialized. Higher headquarters issued contradictory orders. The demolition charges that should have been permanently installed on the bridge were still stored in a building near the western approach, waiting for authorization to be replaced that seemed to require signatures from officers who were dead, captured, or simply unreachable. When Engerman's lead elements of the American 9th Armoured Division emerged from the woods overlooking Remagen at approximately 1 o'clock on the afternoon of March 7th, the sight that greeted them seemed almost surreal. German military vehicles were still crossing the bridge in steady procession. Civilians crowded the approaches, pushing handcarts loaded with possessions, dragging children, fleeing the approaching Americans. The structure stood intact, its demolition charges visible as dark rectangular shapes attached to the steelwork. Smoke from earlier American artillery strikes drifted across the town, but the bridge itself appeared undamaged. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, standing beside Engerman on the heights, understood the significance better than most American officers. His fluency in German and his understanding of German military doctrine told him that this situation should not exist. Every principle of Wehrmacht defensive strategy demanded that this bridge be destroyed. Its continued existence represented either monumental incompetence or a breakdown so complete that German forces had simply lost control of events. Either way, the opportunity had to be seized immediately. Brigadier General William Hogue, commander of Combat Command B, arrived at the observation point at approximately 2:45 in the afternoon. He was a stocky, aggressive officer, known for rapid decision-making and a willingness to take calculated risks. When he raised his binoculars and saw the intact bridge, his mind immediately grasped the strategic implications. This was not merely an opportunity to cross the Rhine ahead of schedule. This was a chance to vault 3 weeks ahead of Field Marshal Montgomery's meticulously planned Operation Plunder, scheduled for late March with elaborate airborne drops and massive artillery preparations. Hogue made the decision that would define his career and alter the course of the war. We're taking that bridge. We're taking it now. German defenders were caught in the worst possible tactical situation. Major Scheller had arrived at the bridge approach just over 2 hours earlier, exhausted from his nightmarish journey and stunned by what he found. Captain Bratke briefed him quickly. The bridge was prepared for demolition with electrical detonators controlled from a switching station in the eastern tunnel entrance. A backup system consisted of a primer cord fuse that could be ignited manually. The defensive perimeter was essentially non-existent. Most of the troops Scheller had expected to commandeer for defense were already across the bridge or bypassing Remagen entirely, fleeing east ahead of the American advance. The fog that had blanketed the morning lifted at precisely the worst moment for German forces, giving American artillery observers perfect visibility. At approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, American tanks appeared at the western approach to the town. The time for deliberation had ended. The assault on Remagen town itself took less than 30 minutes. Lieutenant John Grimball's platoon of M26 Pershing tanks led the advance. The Pershings were so new that most German soldiers had never seen them. Armed with 90mm guns capable of penetrating any German armour at combat ranges, they represented yet another symbol of American industrial supremacy. The psychological impact on German defenders was immediate and devastating. The tanks fired white phosphorus rounds to create smoke screens, masking the advance of infantry. They hammered German positions with high-explosive shells that turned buildings into clouds of pulverized stone and shattered timber. Timmerman's infantry followed close behind the tanks, moving through streets that showed the accumulated scars of years of Allied bombing. Remagen had been a picturesque Rhine resort town before the war, famous for its thermal springs and scenic views. By March 1945, more than half its buildings stood as hollow shells, their walls holed by bombs, their roofs collapsed into the interiors. The few German soldiers attempting to defend the town fell back quickly toward the bridge. Most simply fled across it, adding to the chaos of vehicles and civilians already crowding the span. Captain Bratke, watching the American advance from his position near the western tower, knew the moment had arrived. He had prepared for this for weeks, going over the demolition sequence in his mind, checking and rechecking the electrical connections. At 3:20, he gave the order to blow the approach ramp on the western side. The explosion created a crater 3 meters wide and nearly 2 meters deep, preventing American tanks from driving directly onto the bridge deck. Debris and smoke filled the air. But when it cleared, the main structure remained standing, intact, beckoning. The race for the bridge had become a matter of minutes and meters. American tanks positioned themselves at the western end, their massive guns traversing to hammer German positions on the eastern heights. The Erpeler Lay, a 180-metre basalt cliff rising dramatically on the eastern bank, bristled with German anti-aircraft guns, whose crews now depressed their barrels to fire directly at American troops in a ground support role they had never trained for. Timmerman's infantry, approximately 120 men from a company of the 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion, began moving across the bridge at approximately 3:50 in the afternoon. They advanced in short rushes, using the bridge's stone towers and iron railings for cover. German machine guns opened fire from the eastern towers and from positions in the tunnel mouth beyond. Bullets ricocheted off steel girders and stone facing, creating a deadly crossfire that filled the air with whining metal fragments. Several Americans fell in the first seconds, their bodies crumpling onto the bridge deck. The rest kept advancing, driven by training, by discipline, by the knowledge that hesitation meant death. Major Scheller, watching from the tunnel entrance on the eastern side of the river, faced the most consequential decision any German officer would make that day. The bridge was loaded with explosives. The electrical detonation system was prepared and tested. American troops were now halfway across the span, exposed, vulnerable. Every instinct, every principle drilled into him during years of military service demanded that he blow the bridge immediately. But Lieutenant Karl Peters of the anti-aircraft artillery had approached him minutes earlier with a desperate plea that invoked higher authority and secret technology. Peters commanded a battery equipped with Henschel rocket launcher systems, weapons classified as top secret by German High Command. The battery was still on the western side of the bridge, trying to navigate through the chaos of retreating vehicles and panicked civilians. Peters could not allow this advanced technology to fall into American hands. The orders regarding secret weapons were absolute. Scheller agreed to wait, a decision born of conflicting imperatives that paralyzed German command throughout the final months of the war. The wait would cost him his life. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the combat engineer responsible for the demolition charges, positioned himself at the electrical detonator in the tunnel mouth. His hands were steady despite the stress. He had prepared this moment for weeks, testing circuits, checking connections, ensuring redundancy in every system. When Peters's rocket launcher battery finally cleared the bridge, struggling through the press of refugees and retreating soldiers, Friesenhahn received the order from Scheller. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, with American troops 2/3 of the way across the bridge and clearly visible through the smoke and chaos, Friesenhahn turned the detonation key with deliberate force. Nothing happened. The electrical system, tested and retested over previous weeks, had failed at the critical moment. A shell had likely cut the wiring during the artillery barrage earlier in the afternoon, though no one would ever determine the exact cause with certainty. Friesenhahn tried again, his hands now shaking slightly. Still nothing. The charges remained inert. The bridge stood solid beneath the boots of advancing American infantry, who were now within 50 meters of the eastern bank. Sergeant Alex Drabick, a 34-year-old butcher from Toledo, Ohio, became the first American soldier to set foot on the eastern bank of the Rhine since Napoleon's armies had crossed in the opposite direction more than a century earlier. Behind him, Timmerman and the rest of A Company kept coming, spreading out along the eastern approach, moving toward the tunnel entrance where German defenders were firing from prepared positions. Engineer Sergeant Eugene Dorland and his team of combat engineers began systematically cutting every wire they could find, racing against time to disconnect the remaining demolition charges before German engineers could activate the backup ignition system. Corporal Anton Faust, a German combat engineer, volunteered for what everyone understood was likely a suicide mission. He emerged from the tunnel entrance, sprinted across approximately 100 meters of open ground under direct fire from multiple American positions, and reached the manual backup detonation point. Bullets kicked up spurts of dust and stone chips around his feet. He ignored them with the fatalism of a man who had accepted death. He ignited the backup primer cord fuse with hands that worked with mechanical precision despite the chaos around him. The explosion that followed at approximately 4:15 sent shockwaves through the entire structure and across the town. The bridge lifted several inches off its foundations, steel girders screaming under stress they were never designed to endure. Smoke and debris filled the air, obscuring vision. American soldiers on the bridge were thrown to the deck, some tumbling against railings, others sprawling flat. But when the smoke began to clear and men could see again, the structure still stood. The main steel arches had suffered damage, visible as twisted metal and stress fractures, but they remained intact. The roadbed sagged in the center, a depression of approximately 6 inches visible to anyone looking along its length. But it was still traversable. The bridge held. The race was over. The Americans had won. The immediate aftermath was controlled chaos powered by training and determination. American combat engineers swarmed onto the bridge, working with frantic intensity to remove remaining demolition charges and assess structural damage. Lieutenant Colonel Harvey Fraser's 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion began establishing a defensive perimeter on the eastern side, expanding outward from the tunnel entrance across the slopes of the Erpelleer. German resistance collapsed with stunning rapidity. Captain Bratke and most of his remaining troops took shelter in the 400-metre railroad tunnel that ran beneath the Erpelleer, emerging on the other side of the cliff where they hoped to escape American encirclement. By 5:30 in the evening, Lieutenant Timmerman and his men had secured both tunnel entrances and captured several hundred prisoners, most of them looking relieved that their war was over. Major Scheller made a fatal decision born of desperation and military training that emphasized duty above survival. Realizing that the bridge was lost and that he bore formal responsibility for its defense, he commandeered a bicycle from a civilian and rode east through the gathering darkness to find his corps headquarters and explain what had happened. He believed that a personal report from the responsible officer might mitigate the consequences. He was wrong. He would be arrested 4 days later, court-martialed in proceedings that lasted less than an hour, and executed by firing squad as a scapegoat for a failure that had dozens of fathers but required a few to die as examples. News of the bridge's capture travelled up the American chain of command with electric speed. At approximately 5 o'clock, Brigadier General Hogue radioed his division commander, Major General John Leonard, with words that were terse and miraculous in equal measure. "We got the bridge intact." Leonard, a career officer who had fought in the First World War and understood the significance of Rhine crossings from historical study and personal experience, immediately relayed the information to First Army headquarters. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges was conferring with his operations staff when the call came through. According to witnesses present in the room, Hodges grabbed the telephone so quickly he knocked over his coffee cup, sending liquid spreading across maps of the Rhine front. Within minutes, he was on the line with General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group. "Brad, we've got a bridge," Hodges said, his voice vibrating with an excitement that his normally reserved demeanour rarely displayed. "A bridge? You mean you've got one intact on the Rhine?" Bradley asked, standing up from his desk so abruptly his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "Yep." Leonard nabbed the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen before the Germans could blow it. "The thing is standing there like a gift from God." Bradley's response became legendary among the American High Command, repeated in staff meetings and memoirs for decades afterward. "Hot dog, Courtney. This will bust the whole thing wide open. Get everything you can across that bridge. Pour it on." Bradley immediately placed a call to Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower at his headquarters in Reims, France. Eisenhower grasped the significance instantly with the strategic vision that had made him Supreme Commander. The capture represented what he later described as one of those rare and fleeting opportunities that occasionally arise in war and which, if properly grasped and exploited, have incalculable effects on determining future success. His original operational plan had called for Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group to make the primary Rhine crossing near Wessel in late March, supported by elaborate airborne operations involving 2 divisions and massive artillery preparations that would take weeks to organize. The American crossing farther south was supposed to be secondary, smaller in scale, carefully coordinated to avoid drawing German reserves away from Montgomery's sector. The Remagen Bridge changed everything. Eisenhower ordered Bradley to exploit the bridgehead immediately with every available unit. The strategic focus of the entire Western Front shifted south in a matter of hours. Staff officers scrambled to redirect divisions that had been moving north toward Montgomery's planned crossing. Supply priorities were rewritten. The careful choreography of the Allied advance was abandoned in favour of opportunistic exploitation. The German reaction combined strategic despair with murderous scapegoating. When news reached the Führer at his bunker headquarters in Berlin, His response mixed political calculation with homicidal rage. He had been clinging to increasingly delusional hopes that the Rhine would buy him time to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies, using the natural barrier to demonstrate that Germany could still defend itself and was worth treating as something other than an enemy to be utterly destroyed. The entire German defensive strategy in the West hinged on using the river as a barrier behind which shattered divisions could be reconstituted, re-equipped and redeployed for a final defense. An intact American bridgehead 3 weeks ahead of the expected timetable demolished that strategy. The Führer's immediate response was characteristically simple: find someone to blame and kill them publicly. He summoned General Lieutenant Rudolf Hübner, a fanatical loyalist known for his ruthlessness on the Eastern Front and his willingness to execute subordinates for failures. Hübner was given command of a flying special court-martial, essentially a travelling execution squad with a thin veneer of judicial proceedings. Hübner was accompanied by 2 lieutenant colonels and 2 military policemen who would serve as the firing squad. None of the officers had legal training or experience conducting courts-martial. Hübner explicitly rejected offers of copies of the German military code of justice when they were offered by more conventionally minded staff officers. He declared that the only authority he needed was the Führer's personal order and the absolute necessity of making examples to restore discipline. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the aristocratic commander of all German forces in the West, was dismissed from his position on March 10th. He was too old, too conventional, too tied to pre-Nazi military traditions to suit the regime's needs in the final desperate months. The Führer's paranoia demanded a scapegoat of appropriate rank and visibility. Rundstedt was replaced by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, hastily transferred from command of German forces in Italy, where he had been conducting a skillful defensive campaign. Kesselring was known as the Führer's firefighter for his ability to stabilize deteriorating situations through a combination of tactical skill and ruthless determination. But even Kesselring recognized immediately upon arrival that the situation at Remagen was beyond stabilization. He later described the bridge's loss as catastrophic, stating that it broke the defensive front along the Rhine and made any sustained defense of Western Germany impossible. The psychological impact on the German officer corps was devastating. Officers who had maintained some hope of holding the Rhine long enough to negotiate favourable surrender terms now understood that the war was entering its final phase, that defeat was not merely probable but inevitable and imminent. The flying court-martial began its murderous work with bureaucratic efficiency that would have been darkly comic if lives were not at stake. General Major Richard von Bothmer, who had nominal command of the Bonn-Remagen sector despite never actually reaching the bridge due to American forces cutting the roads, was tried on March 9th. The proceedings lasted 37 minutes. He was convicted of dereliction of duty through failure to personally verify the bridge's demolition status, demoted to private as an additional humiliation, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Von Bothmer, whose wife was dead and whose only son had been killed fighting on the Eastern Front, grabbed a pistol from a court official during a moment of inattention and shot himself in the head in the courtroom. He died instantly, denying the regime the satisfaction of further punishment. On March 11th, the court-martial arrived at Field Marshal Model's Army Group B headquarters. 4 officers were tried that day in proceedings that collectively lasted less than 3 hours. Major Hans Scheller was convicted of failing to blow the bridge despite having arrived only 2 hours before the American attack, despite having only 36 combat-effective troops available, despite having done everything humanly possible under impossible circumstances. The fact that he had acted correctly according to all existing orders was irrelevant. Someone had to die, and Scheller had been present when the bridge was lost. Lieutenant Karl Peters was convicted of allowing his secret rocket launcher system to fall into American hands. The fact that he had pleaded for time to evacuate the equipment, that Scheller had agreed to the delay, that the equipment was eventually captured because the bridge remained intact, none of this mattered. Peters had been associated with the failure, therefore Peters would die. Majors August Kraft and Herbert Strobel, combat engineers who had laid the original charges days earlier, according to standard procedures, and who were 60 kilometers away when the bridge was captured, were convicted of insufficient preparation of the demolition system. The fact that the system had failed due to combat damage to wiring, not improper installation, was legally irrelevant. All 4 men were sentenced to death by firing squad. The executions were carried out on March 14th in forests near the small villages of Rimbach and Oberriesen. The condemned men were transported in a truck, their hands bound, their faces showing varying degrees of resignation and defiance. They were led into the woods in the early morning, forced to kneel before shallow graves that had been dug the previous evening. 4 soldiers stepped forward, raised their rifles, and fired single shots into the back of each condemned man's neck. The bodies were pushed into the graves and covered with earth. No markers were placed. The regime wanted these men forgotten, erased, their deaths serving only as warnings to other officers that failure would not be tolerated even in the war's final days. While German officers were being executed for losing the bridge, American forces were pouring across it in numbers that grew exponentially with each passing hour. The structure itself remained standing, but was clearly damaged from the German demolition attempt. Engineers worked around the clock in shifts, shoring up weakened sections with timber and steel beams scrounged from nearby buildings. They repaired the approach ramp where the initial German explosion had created a crater, building a temporary roadway that allowed vehicles to mount the bridge deck. Combat engineer battalions erected massive lights for nighttime traffic, turning the bridge into an illuminated causeway visible for kilometers. Military police directed the flow of men and vehicles with whistle signals and hand gestures, maintaining order despite the chaos of rapid deployment. Within 24 hours of the capture, more than 8,000 American troops had crossed into the bridgehead on the eastern bank. Tank companies, artillery batteries, infantry battalions, supply units, medical detachments, all flowing across the only intact Rhine bridge between Switzerland and the North Sea. But American commanders knew the bridge could collapse at any moment. The structural damage was obvious to anyone looking at the sagging roadbed and the visible stress fractures in the steel arches. Combat engineers began construction of tactical bridges immediately, working with an urgency that reflected understanding of how precarious the situation remained. By March 9th, 48 hours after the capture, the first tactical bridge was completed just north of the damaged Ludendorff Bridge. This was an M1940 aluminum alloy treadway bridge, a marvel of American engineering that could be erected in less than 24 hours and support the weight of Sherman tanks. Work began immediately on a second bridge, this one a floating pontoon bridge that required constant maintenance to account for the Rhine's powerful current. The American plan was to make the bridgehead irreversible regardless of what happened to the original structure. Multiple crossing points would ensure that even if the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed or was destroyed by German counterattack, the flow of men and material could continue uninterrupted. The German response to the bridgehead was everything the Nazi High Command's rapidly diminishing strategic reserves could muster. By March 1945, those reserves consisted primarily of ad hoc battle groups thrown together from shattered divisions, rear echelon units pressed into frontline service, and whatever forces could be scraped together from training schools and replacement depots. The Luftwaffe, which had once dominated European skies and now existed as a shadow of its former power, launched repeated desperate air attacks against the bridge. Over the next 10 days, American intelligence officers counted 367 separate German air sorties targeting the Remagen area. The Americans responded by assembling the largest concentration of anti-aircraft artillery in the entire European theatre. 5 complete anti-aircraft battalions with hundreds of guns created a defensive box around the bridge that extended for several kilometers in all directions. The anti-aircraft battles became some of the most intense of the entire war. Gun crews fired until barrels glowed red from heat. Shells arced through the sky in streams of tracer fire that created a deadly web above the Rhine. American gunners claimed to have shot down more than 100 German aircraft in the 10 days following the bridge's capture, though German records suggest the actual number was lower. Regardless of the exact count, the air defence succeeded in its primary mission. Not a single German bomb struck the Ludendorff Bridge despite hundreds of attempts. The Germans employed their newest and most advanced technology in desperate attempts to destroy the crossing. Arado R-234 jet bombers, the world's first operational jet bombers and marvels of German engineering, attacked in high-speed diving runs that exceeded 800 kilometers per hour. The jets were nearly impossible to intercept with conventional piston-engined fighters. Their speed made them invulnerable to most anti-aircraft fire, but their bombing accuracy at high speed proved to be poor, a limitation that German crews had not fully appreciated during training. Most bombs released from jets travelling at maximum speed missed the target by hundreds of meters. The Germans also deployed Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighters in ground attack roles. These aircraft, capable of speeds exceeding 850 kilometers per hour, represented German technological innovation at its absolute peak. Each Me 262 was a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering, incorporating swept wings, axial flow turbojet engines, and weapons systems that could have revolutionized air combat if deployed in sufficient numbers 2 years earlier. But in March 1945, they were too few, arrived too late, and were flown by pilots who often had minimal jet experience. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. Technology alone could not overcome the massive imbalance of forces. The Führer personally authorized the use of V-2 rockets against the Remagen bridgehead, marking the first and only time these strategic terror weapons were employed against a tactical military target. The V-2 was a technological marvel, a liquid-fueled ballistic missile that reached speeds exceeding 5,000 kilometers per hour and struck without warning because it travelled faster than sound. The weapon had been designed to terrorize London and other Allied cities, to break civilian morale through random strikes that could not be prevented or predicted. Using it against a bridge demonstrated how desperate the situation had become. 11 V-2 rockets were launched at Remagen from sites in the Netherlands, approximately 130 kilometers distant. The rockets killed a handful of American soldiers and an unknown number of German civilians in nearby towns when warheads impacted far from their intended target. Not one rocket hit the bridge. The V-2's guidance system, revolutionary for its time, was simply not accurate enough to hit a target as small as a bridge from that distance. The rockets served only to demonstrate technological capability without achieving any military effect. German engineers sent frogmen down the Rhine, 7 naval demolition specialists wearing Italian-made underwater breathing apparatus and carrying explosives designed to be attached to the bridge's underwater foundations. The Americans had anticipated this threat and deployed canal defence lights, a secret technology developed originally for defending British ports. These powerful lights projected intense beams across and below the water surface, eliminating the cover of darkness that underwater attackers required. All 7 frogmen were killed or captured before reaching the bridge. Their bodies were pulled from the Rhine by American engineers, who examined the Italian breathing equipment with professional interest before turning the corpses over to Graves registration. The Germans floated explosive-laden boats down the river, disguised as debris in hopes they would drift unnoticed until striking the bridge. American engineers stretched steel cables across the Rhine upstream from the bridge, creating barriers that caught the boats before they could reach their target. The Germans deployed the Karl Gerät, a 600mm super-heavy siege mortar that fired shells weighing over 2 tons. This weapon was one of the largest artillery pieces ever built, designed to demolish fortifications that could withstand conventional artillery. Each shell carried enough explosive to create a crater 15 meters wide and 6 meters deep. But the weapon's accuracy was limited by its design. Moving it into firing position required days of preparation and specialized transport equipment. The few shells fired at the bridge from the Karl Gerät missed their target by significant margins, creating massive craters in fields and forests, but achieving no damage to the structure itself. Every failed German attack on the bridge reinforced American morale while demonstrating the enemy's desperation. Soldiers fighting in the bridgehead understood they were witnessing the death throes of the Nazi regime. Many German soldiers had been expecting orders to mount suicidal counterattacks against the bridgehead, orders they knew would accomplish nothing except their own deaths. When those orders failed to materialize or were issued and then cancelled due to lack of forces to execute them, even the most dedicated soldiers began to understand that the war was truly lost. The strategic calculations were brutally mathematical. With American forces already established across the Rhine in strength, the river had ceased to function as a defensive barrier. Every German division deployed to contain the Remagen bridgehead was a division unavailable to defend against Montgomery's planned crossing operation in the north or against the Soviet juggernaut grinding westward from Poland. The German defensive front was being pulled apart by forces it could no longer contain. Resources were insufficient, reinforcements were non-existent. The Wehrmacht was experiencing systemic collapse after 5 years of war had consumed its best soldiers, destroyed its equipment reserves, and shattered its logistical infrastructure. Major General Karl Wegener, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Walter Model, later provided the most concise German assessment of Remagen's strategic impact during post-war interrogations. The capture of the bridge signalled the end of the war for Germany, Wegener stated with the analytical precision of a staff officer trained to assess strategic realities. The Remagen affair caused profound shame and guilt throughout the German High Command. It demonstrated conclusively that the Allies now possessed complete initiative and that German forces could only react defensively, never regain the offensive advantage. The failure to destroy the bridge symbolized complete breakdown of German command and control, the inability to execute even the most basic military operations. For German officers trained in the Prussian tradition that emphasized military excellence, professional competence, and flawless execution of orders, this failure cut deeply. It was not merely a tactical defeat to be absorbed and compensated for through subsequent operations. It was evidence of moral collapse, proof that the Wehrmacht that had conquered most of Europe in 1940 had disintegrated beyond recognition. The army that had executed flawless combined arms operations across Poland and France now could not even blow up a bridge when American troops were in plain sight. The Ludendorff Bridge collapsed on March 17th at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The structure had stood for 10 days under conditions no engineer had anticipated or planned for. American traffic had been continuous, literally thousands of vehicles crossing and recrossing around the clock. German artillery had scored several direct hits that weakened already damaged structural members. Air attacks had caused cumulative stress through near misses and the shock waves from heavy bombs exploding nearby. The vibrations from explosions in the surrounding area had transmitted through the bedrock foundations. Most significantly, the bridge had suffered extensive damage during the German demolition attempt on March 7th that had lifted the entire structure off its foundations before settling back into position with unknown internal damage. Witnesses present when the collapse occurred reported hearing sounds like rifle shots in the minutes before the final failure. These were rivets popping free as steel members twisted beyond their design tolerances. Engineers working on reinforcement efforts noticed cracks propagating through steel girders, spreading visibly even as they worked. Warnings were shouted. Men began running for the ends of the bridge. Then a vertical hanger on the southern arch snapped with a sound like a cannon shot. The structure shuddered. Another hanger failed. The entire center span lifted briefly as failing members released stored stress energy, then fell into the Rhine with a roar that could be heard for kilometers. 28 American combat engineers died in the collapse, their bodies carried downstream by the powerful current or trapped beneath tons of twisted steel and shattered stone. More than 60 others were injured, some seriously. Most victims were members of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion, men who had been working desperately on repairs at the moment structural failure occurred. The irony was bitter and cruel. The same engineers who had saved the bridge through their frantic work to disarm German demolition charges now died because their heroic repair efforts could not overcome accumulated damage. But by the time the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed into the Rhine, it had become strategically irrelevant, having served its purpose and more. American combat engineers had completed construction of 2 tactical bridges and were finishing a 3rd. Pontoon bridges, treadway bridges, and Bailey bridges now spanned the Rhine at multiple points near Remagen. More than 25,000 American troops had crossed the damaged Ludendorff Bridge before its collapse. After the structure fell, the rate of crossing actually increased because the tactical bridges could handle heavier traffic more efficiently than the damaged original structure. By March 25th, 6 entire divisions with their tanks, artillery, and complete supply trains had established themselves east of the Rhine. The bridgehead was 8 miles deep and 25 miles wide, encompassing 11 kilometers of the critical autobahn that connected the Ruhr industrial region with Frankfurt. American forces were now positioned to drive deep into central Germany, threatening to cut off German forces throughout the western regions and linking up with Soviet armies advancing from the east. The breakout from the Remagen bridgehead began on March 25th with attacks all along the perimeter. American armoured divisions that had been constrained by the narrow bridgehead suddenly exploded eastward into terrain that offered excellent ground for mobile operations. Combat Command B of the 9th Armoured Division covered 108 kilometres in a single day of advance. Combat Command A of the same division advanced 110 kilometres in 11 hours, a rate of movement that would have been considered impossible in earlier years of the war. German resistance evaporated with shocking rapidity as units simply disintegrated under the pressure of American advance. Entire formations surrendered rather than face annihilation. On March 29th, Combat Command A captured more than 1,200 prisoners in a single engagement when an entire German regiment simply stopped fighting. The American advance was so rapid that German commanders frequently lost contact with their own units. Division headquarters could not locate their subordinate regiments. Corps headquarters had no idea where divisions were positioned. The command structure that had held the Wehrmacht together through 5 years of war was experiencing complete systems failure. Field Marshal Model's Army Group B, which had numbered approximately 325,000 men before the Remagen breakout, began to disintegrate as a cohesive military force. Divisions lost contact with Corps headquarters. Corps lost contact with Army commands. Communication systems broke down through a combination of equipment failure, destroyed infrastructure, and American signals intelligence that could locate and target German radio transmissions within minutes. The strategic implications cascaded through the entire German defensive system like dominoes falling in sequence. Model found himself commanding an army group that was simultaneously trying to defend against the Remagen bridgehead expansion, contain American forces breaking out from other Rhine crossing sites that had been established following Remagen's success, and prevent complete encirclement of the Ruhr industrial region. All 3 objectives were impossible to achieve simultaneously with the forces available, which were diminishing daily through combat losses, desertions, and the simple collapse of units that had been pushed beyond human endurance. The Ruhr, containing 80% of Germany's coal and steel production and representing the industrial heart that had powered the Nazi war machine, was about to be cut off from the rest of Germany. Model understood with the clarity of a professional soldier facing inevitable defeat that losing the Ruhr meant losing any possibility of continued war production. Without coal and steel, the Wehrmacht could not replace tanks, manufacture ammunition, fuel vehicles, or sustain organized resistance. The loss of the Remagen bridge had created conditions that led inexorably to the loss of the Ruhr. The loss of the Ruhr meant the end was measured in weeks, not months. By March 31st, just 3 weeks after the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge, all 4 American armies operating on the Western Front had successfully crossed the Rhine at multiple points. The river crossing that Allied planners had anticipated would require elaborate amphibious operations similar to D-Day, would cost tens of thousands of casualties, and would consume weeks or months of hard fighting had been accomplished with remarkable speed and relatively light losses. The Rhine, which had held Roman legions at bay 2,000 years earlier and had served as Germany's primary western defensive rampart throughout recorded history, had been breached at multiple points in less than 30 days. General Eisenhower's assessment in his memoirs captured the magnitude of achievement. We were across the Rhine on a permanent bridge before the Germans could react effectively. The traditional defensive barrier protecting the heart of Germany was pierced. The final defeat of the enemy, which we had calculated would require spring and summer campaigning in 1945, was suddenly in our minds measurably closer, perhaps only weeks away. This American assessment was echoed by observers from other Allied nations. War correspondents from a dozen countries declared that the war had been shortened by months. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, whose meticulously planned Operation Plunder had been somewhat eclipsed by the opportunistic American success at Remagen, acknowledged the strategic significance with professional grace, while perhaps privately regretting that the breakthrough had not occurred in his sector. Soviet commanders, monitoring the rapid Allied advance from their positions in Poland and eastern Germany, accelerated their own offensive operations to ensure Soviet forces would reach Berlin before the Western Allies. What had been planned as a carefully coordinated final assault became a race as both sides recognized that the collapse of German resistance was accelerating beyond anyone's predictions. German military authorities offered varying assessments when asked after the war how much the loss of the bridge had shortened the conflict. Some claimed the bridge's capture advanced the end by weeks. Others suggested months. The truth was that precise calculations were impossible because strategic effects were systemic and cascading rather than linear and additive. The bridge's capture had not merely advanced the Allied operational timetable by a fixed amount, it had fundamentally altered German strategic options in ways that compounded over time. Before Remagen, German commanders could imagine holding the Rhine through April and possibly into May, using that time to reinforce defences around Berlin, redeploy divisions from secondary theatres, possibly even negotiate with Western allies for a separate peace that would allow Germany to concentrate remaining forces against the Soviet threat from the east. After Remagen, such calculations became delusional fantasy disconnected from military reality. The Rhine had fallen 3 weeks ahead of schedule. German reserves that should have been available to defend against Montgomery's northern crossing had been consumed in futile attempts to eliminate the Remagen bridgehead. The psychological impact on German troops throughout the entire Western theatre was incalculable but devastating. Soldiers who had been told the Rhine would hold now knew that command had lost control of events. The river barrier that propaganda had declared impregnable had been crossed almost casually through a combination of American aggression and German command failure. If the Rhine could not hold, what could? Colonel F. Russell Lyons, the 3rd Corps engineer whose men had captured and held the bridge during those critical first hours, estimated that having an intact bridge saved the Allies approximately 2 months of hard fighting and prevented roughly 35,000 casualties. This calculation was based on detailed comparison with the amphibious operations required at other Rhine crossing sites where no intact bridges were available. At Wesel, where Montgomery's Operation Plunder unfolded according to plan, the British and Americans had assembled over 1,200 artillery pieces, conducted elaborate airborne drops involving 2 complete divisions, and suffered substantial casualties despite possessing overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower. At Remagen, American forces had crossed with minimal initial casualties because the intact bridge eliminated the most vulnerable phase of any opposed river crossing, the actual water transit in assault boats while under fire from prepared defensive positions. Historian Ken Heckler, who spent years after the war conducting extensive interviews with participants from both sides and examining captured German documents, concluded that the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge materially hastened the ending of the war in a measurable way. Other military historians have suggested the capture shortened the European war by between 3 and 6 months, depending on assumptions about how German resistance would have evolved if the Rhine line had held into late spring. The variations in estimates reflected different analytical methodologies and assumptions about counterfactual scenarios that never occurred. But scholarly consensus was clear. Remagen had been a genuine turning point, one of those rare moments when a single tactical event produces strategic consequences far beyond its immediate scope. The human cost of the battle provides another measure of significance that transcends purely military calculations. American casualties in the Battle of Remagen and subsequent fighting in the expanding bridgehead totaled approximately 860 killed in action, with nearly 5,700 wounded and several thousand missing or captured in the confused fighting that characterized rapid mobile operations. These were heavy losses representing real human tragedy. Families destroyed, futures extinguished, dreams ended. But the casualties were concentrated in the first 18 days of fighting from March 7th through March 25th. After the breakout, American casualties declined dramatically as German resistance collapsed. German casualties in the same period exceeded 11,000 prisoners captured, with killed and wounded numbers that were never accurately tallied, but certainly exceeded 10,000 and possibly reached 15,000 or more. The disparity in casualty ratios reflected fundamental imbalances. Americans possessed air superiority so complete that German movement in daylight was nearly suicidal. Americans had artillery superiority that allowed them to mass fires against any concentration of German forces. Americans had armoured superiority in both quantity and quality of tanks. Perhaps most importantly, Americans had the psychological advantage that comes from knowing with certainty that you are winning, that the war's outcome is decided, that sacrifice serves victory rather than merely delaying inevitable defeat. Germans had contradictory orders that paralyzed decision-making, equipment that was breaking down from lack of maintenance and spare parts, fuel shortages that immobilized vehicles, and the growing certainty shared by junior officers and enlisted men alike that the war was lost and further resistance merely prolonged suffering without changing outcomes. The executions of German officers held responsible for losing the bridge cast a dark shadow over military honor and the Wehrmacht's professional culture. Major Hans Scheller had been a 31-year-old career officer with an exemplary service record spanning both Eastern and Western fronts. He was married with young children he would never see grow up. His crime had been arriving at a critical defensive position 2 hours before enemy forces appeared and failing to perform a miracle with 36 exhausted soldiers against several thousand Americans supported by tanks and overwhelming artillery. Lieutenant Karl Peters had been a technical specialist trying desperately to save classified equipment from capture in accordance with standing orders that emphasized preserving advanced technology from enemy intelligence. His execution occurred despite testimony that he had acted correctly according to all existing directives. Majors Kraft and Strobel had been following standard engineering procedures for preparing demolition charges. None of the 4 men deserved death under any reasonable standard of military justice. All 4 were scapegoats sacrificed to demonstrate that the regime would punish failure even as the entire structure of German military power collapsed around them. After the war ended, General Lieutenant Rudolf Hübner, who had presided over the flying court-martial with its predetermined verdicts and summary executions, was himself tried by German courts during the denazification process. He was convicted of judicial murder and sentenced to 4 years' imprisonment, a modest penalty for taking 4 lives through legal proceedings that violated every principle of military justice. But the conviction established an important precedent. Even in Germany's darkest hour, even when the regime demanded scapegoats, some officers recognized that the trials were travesties that brought dishonor to German military traditions. The final assessment of Remagen's significance must include its role in Allied strategic debates about how to conclude the European war. Before the bridge's capture, there had been serious discussion in Allied councils about whether to halt at the Rhine and allow Soviet forces to bear the primary burden of the final assault on Germany. Some British and American strategic planners argued that crossing the Rhine would prove extremely costly, requiring elaborate amphibious operations and resulting in heavy casualties. They suggested that Soviet forces attacking from the east could accomplish the same strategic objective of destroying remaining German military power with less cost in Western Allied lives. Political considerations about post-war occupation zones and spheres of influence were balanced against military assessments of likely casualties. Remagen made that entire debate irrelevant overnight. With American forces already across the Rhine in strength and rapidly expanding their bridgehead, any suggestion of halting the advance made no strategic or operational sense. The momentum must be maintained, the opportunity must be exploited. The rapid advance from the Rhine to the Elbe River, accomplished in just over a month of mobile operations that covered hundreds of kilometers, vindicated the decision to push forward aggressively. American forces met Soviet forces at Torgau on the Elbe River on April 25th, cutting Germany in two and making organized resistance impossible. By May 8th, Germany surrendered unconditionally to all Allied powers. The bridge's capture reverberated through American domestic politics and public opinion in ways that transcended purely military significance. News of the intact bridge reached the United States Senate, while that body was in session debating war appropriations. When the announcement was made, the Senate's presiding officer suspended the chamber's rule against demonstrations of approval. Senators from both parties stood and applauded. Newspapers across America ran banner headlines declaring that the end of the war in Europe was finally in sight after years of grinding combat. War bond sales surged as Americans responded to positive news after months of casualties and slow progress. The psychological impact on American public morale was substantial and measurable. In Germany, news of the bridge's loss spread through military and civilian populations, despite regime attempts to suppress information. Germans had been told repeatedly by propaganda that the Rhine was Germany's impregnable western rampart, that Allied armies would shatter themselves against its defences, just as ancient Rome's legions had been unable to permanently cross the river 2,000 years earlier. The discovery that the Rhine had been crossed almost casually, that a strategic bridge had remained intact through a combination of American tactical opportunism and German command dysfunction, destroyed what little faith remained in the regime's competence and its promises of eventual victory through secret weapons and political reversal. The physical remains of the Ludendorff Bridge tell their own story about how history is remembered and memorialized. After the war concluded, the collapsed structure was not rebuilt. The twisted steel and shattered stone were cleared from the Rhine to restore navigation, but the towers on both banks remained standing as monuments to events that had occurred there. The western towers were eventually converted into the Friedensmuseum Brücke von Remagen, a peace museum whose exhibits trace the bridge's history from its construction by Russian prisoners during the First World War through its destruction in the Second. Special attention focuses on the March 1945 battle and its strategic consequences, with artifacts, photographs, and personal accounts from soldiers who fought there. The eastern towers on the Erpel side now serve as a performing arts space, hosting concerts and cultural events. The deliberate contrast between wartime and peacetime uses makes a statement about transformation, about how places of violence and death can become venues for creation and life. The soldiers who captured the bridge received recognition commensurate with their extraordinary achievement under fire. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor in combat. Sergeant Alex Drabick received the same decoration for being the first soldier across. Dozens of other soldiers from the 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion and the 14th Tank Battalion received Silver Stars and Bronze Stars for heroism during the assault and the subsequent defence of the bridgehead. Brigadier General William Hogue was promoted to command of an entire corps, recognition of his decisive leadership in recognising and exploiting the opportunity. The entire 9th Armoured Division received a Presidential Unit Citation, an honour bestowed on military units for extraordinary heroism in action. These awards recognised individual and collective courage, but they could not fully capture the significance of what had been accomplished. The men who crossed that bridge under fire while German machine guns sought to kill them had not merely secured a tactical objective to be noted in after-action reports. They had participated in a moment that fundamentally changed the war's trajectory. Every day the war was shortened through their actions meant thousands of lives saved, both military and civilian. Every week of accelerated victory meant thousands of concentration camp prisoners liberated sooner, thousands of forced labourers freed, thousands of civilians no longer subject to aerial bombardment and artillery fire. The soldiers who fought at Remagen contributed directly to that humanitarian outcome through their tactical courage. The Remagen story raises profound questions about chance and contingency in history that philosophers and historians continue to debate. If the morning fog had not lifted precisely when it did, would American scouts have spotted the intact bridge before German engineers destroyed it? If the electrical detonation system had functioned as designed and tested, would the bridge have been destroyed with American troops on it, turning a triumph into a tragedy? If Major Scheller had arrived at his post 2 hours earlier instead of being delayed by the chaos of collapsing German logistics, would he have ensured the demolition charges were properly installed and functional? Each of these questions suggests an alternate history, a world in which the Remagen Bridge was destroyed according to German plans, and the Rhine crossing proceeded according to the original Allied timetable with its elaborate preparations and anticipated heavy casualties. The accumulation of contingencies, the series of small failures and coincidences that led to the bridge's capture, suggests that history is not rigidly deterministic, that individual decisions and random events can produce consequences far beyond what anyone could anticipate in the moment. Yet the capture also illustrates that chance favours those prepared to exploit it. American forces were positioned to recognize the opportunity because they were aggressively advancing, maintaining pressure, staying alert for possibilities. German forces failed to destroy the bridge not merely because of mechanical malfunction, but because of systemic command failures that reflected deeper problems of strategic overextension, contradictory orders, and regime paranoia that paralyzed decision-making. The final assessment must return to the human dimension that gives the story its enduring power. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge was accomplished by individual men acting under conditions of extraordinary stress and mortal danger. Lieutenant Timmerman leading his infantry company across a bridge that could explode at any moment, knowing that one functional detonator meant death for everyone on the span. Sergeant Drabick sprinting toward the eastern bank while German machine guns fired at him, choosing to advance rather than seek cover because the mission demanded speed. Combat engineers working under direct fire to cut wires and disarm demolition charges, understanding that one mistake meant instant death, but continuing because their comrades depended on them. Tank crews providing covering fire from exposed positions on the western bank, knowing they were targets for German artillery, but maintaining their positions because infantry needed support. Staff officers like Hogue and Leonard who recognized the strategic opportunity and made immediate decisions to exploit it rather than waiting for authorization from higher headquarters. Commanders like Hodges and Bradley who grasped the significance and redirected entire armies to capitalize on the breakthrough. Each person in this chain of events made choices that contributed to the outcome. Remove any single link, and the result might have been dramatically different. This recognition of individual agency operating within larger historical forces is what makes the story compelling across generations. The men at Remagen were not merely pawns moved by inexorable historical forces beyond their control, but active participants whose courage and decisions shaped events in ways that reverberated through the final months of the war and beyond. The 80th anniversary of the bridge's capture in March 2025 was marked by ceremonies and commemorations in both Germany and the United States. Veterans organizations, though their ranks have thinned dramatically with the passage of 8 decades, participated alongside family members of soldiers who fought there. Historical societies and military units that trace their lineage to the 9th Armoured Division held remembrance events honouring the soldiers whose actions changed history. The German government acknowledged the battle's significance while emphasising contemporary lessons about the ultimate futility of war and the value of the peace and cooperation that has prevailed in Europe for 80 years since that time. The commemorations reflected the complex legacy of events that look different depending on perspective. For Americans, Remagen remains a moment of triumph, a validation of tactical courage and decisive leadership that shortened a terrible war. For Germans, it serves as a reminder of defeat but also of liberation from a monstrous regime, the beginning of the end that led eventually to democracy and integration into the community of peaceful nations. For military historians, it provides a case study in how tactical opportunism and strategic flexibility can produce results far beyond what elaborate planning achieves. For all participants and observers, it remains a reminder that individual decisions made under pressure in moments of crisis can shape the course of history in ways that echo across generations. The men who captured the bridge at Remagen could not have known that their actions would become the subject of books and films, of scholarly studies and anniversary commemorations. They were soldiers doing their duty under circumstances none would have chosen, following orders, trying to survive, hoping to go home when the war ended. That their duty and their courage led to outcomes of genuine historical significance is testament to the unpredictable nature of war and the enduring importance of individual valor in determining collective fate.